Well, welcome to another Friday night. One of my quests in working in the field of complex trauma is to really help people understand some of the more subtle forms of trauma. So much of the conversation around trauma gets focused on the big T trauma stuff. Severe abuse, severe danger, severe accidents. And so a lot of people come along and go, well, I don't think I have trauma because I haven't had any of that big T trauma. But yet they've got lots of very subtle trauma. Unless they become aware of it, they're not able to really start healing and growing and working on themselves the way they could or should. And so I spend a lot of time just helping people understand some of the more subtle forms of complex trauma. So we've talked about kind of the big three, which is abuse, neglect, and abandonment. And then we've talked about betrayal trauma, cultural trauma, political trauma, captivity trauma, collective trauma, generational trauma. All of those we've tried to explain and develop. What I want to do today and next time is look at some of the even more subtle forms of trauma. And you may have experienced them, you may not. I don't know that. But if you have, I think these talks could really turn some light bulbs on for you and really help you go, oh, that makes sense as to where my trauma comes from. Now, having said that, I just need to give up front kind of a trigger warning. This talk might really bring up a lot of painful stuff for some of you. It might be very overwhelming once the pieces start falling into place. And so just be aware of that. Make sure you have people you can talk to as we go into this discussion tonight. So the very first one I want to focus on is what I call the unwanted baby. So for some of you, you definitely relate to this. So let me give you 3 causes of an unwanted baby feeling. So number 1, your parents might have got pregnant by accident. And when we talk about accidental pregnancies, there's really 2 types. So the one is a mistimed pregnancy. So they kind of want to get pregnant, just not now. And the second is they didn't want to get pregnant at all. It was a pure accident that they're not happy about. So you can see the second one, that when the parents don't want to get pregnant and they do, it's an accident, that the child can feel very unwanted because the parents did not want that pregnancy. The mistimed pregnancy, they wanted to get pregnant, just not now. You can still see how the child could pick up some unwanted stuff. But then there's a second one, and that is the parents wanted a boy, not a girl. And you are a girl, or the other way around. And so you just have always felt your parents wished you were a boy, you were not wanted. And then the third is, if your mother died giving birth to you, all of a sudden your life cost her life, and that makes you kind of unwanted. They'd prefer to have mother over you. So those are the kind of things that can result in a child feeling unwanted. So Hungarian psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi says this: these are the unwelcome guests of the family. And then he goes on to say, someone who is not fully invited into the world. They seem like visitors, outsiders who might leave at any minute. So that's kind of that unwanted child. Now, Drexel University Women Health blog has given some interesting information about unwanted pregnancies. And they said that about half of the pregnancies in the U.S. are unwanted, unplanned, or unintended. So again, they make the 2 categories of mistimed and unwanted. The risk factors for unintended pregnancies tend to be, not always, but tend to be people from a low socioeconomic status, mothers who are drug users, men who are involved, don't have as much education, women who are involved in the sex trade, or the type of contraceptive that was used, or younger women who haven't been using contraceptives properly. So those are kind of the higher risk categories. But what they're also finding, and this is where I really want us to think about, is that they followed what happens with the children who come out of unwanted pregnancies, and they're beginning to see that there's poor maternal and child outcomes. That the children born of unwanted pregnancies are at risk of behavioral and psychological issues in adolescence. In other words, somehow they get complex trauma that results then in maladaptations, behaviors in adolescence that begin to cause a lot of damage. So this whole unwanted pregnancy thing, the unwanted baby, has really led to a discussion. Can a baby in the womb, in utero, sense whether or not they're wanted? And there's a whole bunch of research that's now coming out about this that I find just fascinating. But just let me give you what has been written by several German researchers. And they said this: the fetal autonomic nervous system is negatively affected by maternal adverse emotional states. So there's now evidence that if the mom is not in a good emotional state, if she's going through a lot of negative emotions, it does affect the fetus. There is currently growing evidence to suggest that increased maternal stress during pregnancy can lead to adverse effects on the physiological, metabolic, and neuronal development of the fetus during gestation, with possible long-lasting effects. Generally speaking, adverse maternal emotional states such as depression, anxiety, social stress, discrimination, and general prenatal distress can influence fetal and neonatal motor, cognitive, and social development. And I've just seen repeated research coming out that says that the fetus can be affected by the mother's emotional state. It senses it, and it can activate the child's stress system even within the womb. Emily Guarnada has said this: babies are affected by their parents' emotional state while in the womb, but the full extent is still unknown. So we're still researching this, but we're starting to see patterns. And that can be both positive and negative. So on the positive, for example, when mothers feel joy, their bodies release oxytocin, also known as the bonding hormone. And research from 2007 suggests that the more oxytocin that is released during the first trimester, the more bonding there will be between the mother and the child after birth. So it's going to have very positive effects on the ability of the mother to bond with the child. So if the mother's wanting this child, is excited about this child, and oxytocin is released, that's going to have a very positive effect on attachment once the child is born. But then on the negative, a 2020 study noted that growing babies can be impacted by mood changes, trauma, and complications during pregnancy. So many factors have the potential to interrupt bonding with a child in utero, including anticipatory anxiety. So the mother's nervous about the baby coming or doesn't want the baby coming, financial distress. So just a lot of stress in the person's life. The mother's stressed out, that affects the child. Hormonal changes, substance use, unplanned or unwanted pregnancy, and partner abandonment. So divorce, separation, or death of a partner. All of those creates a very negative emotional world, stressful world for the mother, which affects the baby in utero. So what are the results then beyond just in the uterus? So again, the Drexel University College of Women has said, here's what you can expect is going to happen to a child that was not wanted. So when they are finally born, there's not going to be the attachment with the parents that would have happened if they were deeply wanted, if the parents immediately wanted to connect. There's going to interrupt secure attachment. Then that's going to usually result in either neglect, because the parents just aren't madly in love with this child, so there's going to be some neglect happening, or some abuse. The parents get frustrated easily with the child. The parents lash out at the child. The parents get angry a lot at the child. The parents blame the child for their problems because that child wasn't wanted. And so there's going to be neglect, abuse, mild to severe, that's going to start to happen. Parents might meet the physical needs of the child, but there's going to be a chance that the parents aren't going to fully meet the emotional needs of the child, because it's almost like they got a bit of resentment against this child. They didn't want this child. And so the emotional needs are not going to be met. Usually, the child then won't have parents who are going to regulate its emotions when it's upset, because there's not the secure attachment. There's not the meeting of emotional needs. So the child is not going to develop the tools and ability to regulate their emotions properly. And that's all going to result then in how it affects the development of the brain and how it affects the development of their emotions. So bottom line is, what you're seeing there is that unwanted child is now showing all the signs of complex trauma. It's affecting their brain development, it's affecting their emotional development, and then it's affecting their ability to attach, to regulate their emotions. So it's having lots of negative effects, physiology-wise, right off the bat. But let's take it further to when the child gets older. So what are going to be some of the long-lasting effects on this child who is unwanted? And many of you are going to be able to relate to this, and this is where it's going to start to get maybe painful and overwhelming for you. Often children who were unwanted, they may not have been told that, but somehow they know it. They sense it. But they also may have been told it. What they often find is they have an unconscious wish to die. If I wasn't wanted, then I really don't want to be here. Often they become quite pessimistic and skeptical about life. Life's just a negative thing for them. There's often a mistrust of others that develops early on, because if I wasn't wanted, then I can't trust my parents. So if I can't trust my parents, who can I trust? Many develop suicidal fantasies. If I wasn't wanted, then how can I get out of here? Another characteristic is that they begin to have great difficulty believing they are loved. So let's say somebody comes into their life who does fully love them, but now they don't believe that person really is loving them because they've never experienced that full, genuine love from their parents. So they're going, how can anybody truly love me? So it's almost like when a person heaps love on them, they can't absorb it. It's like water off a duck's back. They just can't believe that anybody would fully love them. So what you can see here is this is producing great shame, deep shame, core belief that the reason I'm not wanted must be because I'm not good enough. I must not be lovable. I must be a loser. I must not have any value. It must somehow be my fault that I'm not loved. And that deep core belief of shame is, to me, one of the most devastating things that comes out of a child not being wanted. That leads to deep insecurities. Every relationship now, there's lots of insecurities of what are people thinking of me? Do they like this about me? Did I do it well enough? Are they going to accept me or reject me? Constant insecurities, which adds tremendous stress to their stress system. But often a deep loneliness, because they're not able to receive love. They have never truly connected with anybody. They just feel all alone in the world. There's a haunting loneliness for them. And with that, they just feel they're never going to fit in anywhere. They'll never belong. They'll always be an outsider. They'll always be kind of unwanted, a black sheep. And so that not fitting in, belonging, is also a haunting feeling. That really then is a fear that they will never be wanted by anybody. Now you can see how devastating this is, how this can lead to deep depression for people. But that fear of never being wanted is just a haunting fear for them. That then leads to every time they get into a relationship, they're afraid that if people get to know me at all, they're going to reject me and abandon me. So they live now in every relationship with that constant fear of rejection and abandonment. And then, because they weren't wanted, they always felt like they were a burden. They were a pain to their parents. And so now in every relationship they go into, they just have this feeling that they're a burden. They're a pain, that people are doing stuff for them and loving them, not because they want to, but because they're obligated to, because they have to. But they don't enjoy it. They don't really want to do it. They long to connect with people, to finally have somebody that wants them, who wants to connect with them. But they have a deep fear of connecting. Because if I connect to people, they'll get to know me. And if they get to know me, then they're not going to want me because nobody else has. And so I want intimacy, but I'm afraid of intimacy. So that begins to affect every relationship. But beyond relationships, they move off into adult life and they get a job. But now they have this irrational fear that the boss is going to want to fire them. Or they get into a relationship and they have an irrational fear that the partner, even though things are going well, wonderful, the partner's getting ready to dump them. Because deep down they feel they're unwanted. So no boss would really want them. No partner would really want them. Everybody's planning to get rid of them. And so they have this fear that any success, any good stuff happening to them isn't going to last. Something bad's going to happen. The other shoe is going to drop. Anything that good is happening is just too good to be true. So don't get your hopes up that life could be fulfilling and wonderful. And that results in many people who are unwanted babies sabotaging every good thing in their life. I'm unwanted, and so I'm going to get dumped eventually. So let's just get it over with. I will mess it up now. I will get other people to dump me. Or if they're in a relationship, I'll abandon you before you abandon me. I am going to get out of this relationship because I'm pretty sure you're eventually going to end it. So I'll get out, and it will hurt less if I do the abandoning than if you abandon me. Then, in another direction, many end up with this deep, deep anger. It's just deep lava that's boiling down there. They have anger at self. They don't like themselves. They wish they were different because they think it's their fault that they were unwanted. They're angry at the world and that never feeling wanted, never feeling like they fit in or belong. And then for some, they just develop an anger at God. Why would you have me born into a family that didn't want me? And that can lead for many people to a deep self-pity. They just develop this victim mentality. Poor me, my life sucks, everything's against me. And they just kind of wallow in this self-pity all the time, feeling sorry for themselves. And it's kind of their way of validating their own pain, but it just feeds off itself. Then in another direction, many people who are unwanted as a child, when they get into adult lives, they are drawn to people who are going to not want them. They are drawn to people who are going to fulfill their self-fulfilling prophecy that nobody will ever want me. So they're, without realizing how, subconsciously drawn to people who will reject them, who will not want them. And so they repeat the same message and reinforce it over and over again. Some, they go to, I need to get people to want me. So they don't naturally want me, but could I do something that will get them to want me? So some become people pleasers. If I just do whatever you want, will you then want me? So that can come out of not being wanted. Others go, if I do everything perfectly, so I'm a perfectionist. Then will you want me? So that's their brain's solution to not being wanted. Even if they get in a relationship and the person seems to want them, they just aren't able to receive love into their soul. So if you were an unwanted child, I hope this just helps make sense out of some of your life. But I also want you to realize that you can heal from this. This is complex trauma. And part of what we do all the time is really help people begin to get to that core shame and the beliefs that came out of not being wanted, and begin to heal that and change that and develop a connection with yourself and with safe people. It's a long journey, but it is a possible journey. The second very subtle type of complex trauma is if you grew up in a family and one of your siblings died. And you could have been fairly young, you could have been a bit older, but your sibling died. So let me talk about what can happen, not in every parent, but in many parents, what happens as far as changes in the parent. So the very first thing is when a child dies, it's like something in the parent dies. So the parent changes very often. They're different. There's just not the same life there. There's not the same vitality there. And that can have a profound effect on the other children. So some of those very practical things that can change in the parent is that the parent now can go from being quite a happy parent to being depressed most of the time or all of the time. They can then become totally focused on the child that they lost, just thinking of memories, going through pictures, going through all their old clothes in their bedroom, and just going to the graveside all the time. They're obsessed with this child that they've lost. And that takes all their time and all their energy. And as a result of that, they're no longer present to the other children. They don't give them their full attention. They don't give them a whole lot of time. And when they're there with them, they don't enjoy them. They don't delight in them the way they used to. So they're just not as present to the other children. But there often is an exception to this. And that is, they can become very attuned and very present to the child if the child is bad, if the child is misbehaving, if the child is angry, if the child is going through a crisis and has been badly hurt. And so all of a sudden what the child is realizing is, I can't connect with mom and dad now when I'm being good, when I'm being responsible. The only way I can connect is if I'm bad or as if I have a crisis. And that sets up some pretty unhealthy dynamics. Another thing that can happen is the parents have been so consumed with the loss of this child and their own grieving that they're emotionally stressed out, they're emotionally exhausted, and so they now become more impatient and angry with the other children. They now have greater demands on the other children, that the other children should just be more responsible. The other children should take care of themselves. The other children shouldn't be needing comfort. And so their demands and expectations of the other children go up, and they get impatient more easily if the children aren't meeting that higher bar. Sometimes what the child begins to pick up is that their parents would love to be reunited with the sibling that's been lost. They almost long to die themselves. Now that you're going to see is going to have a profound effect on the child. And so bottom line is there's secure attachment now is not happening with the child. Another thing that some parents do is they begin to medicate their pain. They're in so much emotional pain, they can't sleep, they don't know how to deal with it, and so they just start medicating it with drugs and alcohol, sleeping medications, anti-anxiety medications, or constant distractions, or food, or running to other relationships with sex involved, or gambling, or endless TV watching, or video games, and so they just numb out. That's their way to try to cope. That has a profound effect on the children. Other parents, 5 years later, 10 years later, there's still part of them stuck in the past. They haven't been able to move on. They can't let go in a healthy way. And so there's something about them that has become frozen in the past. Everybody else has moved on. The children have moved on, but the parents still stuck back there. And that can have a profound effect on the children. Some parents become consumed by guilt. They feel that they could have prevented the death. They could have done something more that would have kept that child alive. And so the parent, so consumed by guilt, doesn't feel that they deserve to be happy again, that they deserve a good life, that they somehow need to be punished for failing this child. That can have a profound effect on the remaining children. Some parents, after they've lost a child, they now are afraid to attach securely to the other children in case one of them dies, and they don't want to go through the pain again. So they pull away from the other children in order to protect themselves from future pain if one of them was to die. And that can have a profound effect on the children. Some parents are so wrapped up in their own pain and grief, and they're overwhelmed by it, that they aren't able to help their children process their grief. And if their children want to talk about their sibling who has died, their children want to cry, their parents shut them down. They get impatient with them. And so that has a profound effect on the children. So that's what's going on in the parent. Now let's kind of take that to, okay, what does that do in the child? We keep saying it's got a profound effect, but what does that effect look like? A whole bunch of things, and I'll go through them very quickly. Some remaining children actually become jealous of the sibling who died, because that dead sibling is the one that's getting all the attention in the family, and they almost wish they were dead in order for them to get some attention. So there's a jealousy of that child, and almost a hatred of that child can develop. Others go through a lot of false guilt, that somehow they could have prevented their sibling's death. They maybe caused it. They didn't do enough. And so they have a lot of false guilt themselves, or that they're not doing enough to help their parents. Some have survivor's guilt, that I should have been the one to die. I was actually kind of a bad kid, and my sibling who died was a really good kid. I should have been the one who died. I feel guilty for being the survivor. Others struggle now to engage in life. They've got all their unprocessed loss and grief themselves from losing their sibling. They just don't know how to deal with it. So they start shutting down stuff, and they don't know how to engage in life. They don't know how to have fun. They don't know how to process all that they're going through. Some go through, I shouldn't have any needs now. I shouldn't desire anything. My parents got enough on their plate. My parents are dealing with way too much. I don't want to add to their burden. So I'm wrong to ask for anything. I'm wrong to express my needs. And so they just shove their needs down. They shove their desires down. Some begin to have suicidal thoughts, that my sibling who died is getting all the attention, and maybe if I died, I get attention, and they start having suicidal thoughts, or they feel so guilty, the world would be better off without me. All those kind of things can happen. Some children develop a codependency with their parents. Their parents are hurting so much and struggling so much that they feel now they got to take care of their parents. They have to parent their parents because their parents aren't doing a very good job of coping. So the child needs to fix the parent and make them happy and help them get through. And that puts a tremendous pressure on the child, because now the child says, I can't have any needs. I got to take care of everybody else's needs. I can't show weakness. I can't cry. I got to be strong for everybody else. And that can do a tremendous amount of damage. Another thing that can happen is the child, because the parents are so absorbed with the loss, the remaining children feel invisible. And that produces a whole deep shame again. I'm nobody. I don't matter. I must not be good enough because my parents don't even notice me anymore. Shame, deep shame. And you're going to see in all of these is that deep shame piece is the powerful core piece that is formed by these things. One of the things that can happen is the child who's still alive actually can feel like they're the child that died, because it's almost like they disappeared. They're now invisible to their parents. So it's almost like they died and they're gone. But the child that died, it's like they are the ones that's alive because they're getting all the attention. And they've appeared big on the radar. And so it's almost like to die means to get noticed, to be alive means to be dead. Everything gets backwards in the mind of the child. Then the child feels like a constant burden now, because mom and dad are just overwhelmed with so much pain and dealing with the loss of this child that any need I have is a burden. Just me being alive is an added burden to them. And so they can feel that deep sense of being a burden or a pain. The other thing that can happen with them is if they're hurting is I don't want to reach out to my parents for comfort because they've got enough on their plate. And so I need to figure out how to take care of myself. I need to be self-sufficient. I need to learn to soothe myself. And so many children develop self-soothing things that can often be quite unhealthy. So they can develop rocking, banging their head, sexual things that make them feel a certain amount of soothing. They can wet their bed, suck their thumb for years. All kinds of self-soothing things can come out of this because they don't feel they can go to their parents for soothing. As you can see, what the child is actually starting to feel is some rejection. Because the parents are totally consumed with the lost child, they're feeling rejected. Then they're going to feel a deep loneliness that's going to come out of that. Then the child might begin to feel that it's wrong for them to have fun, for them to laugh, because that seems to be saying that their parents' grief isn't real. They shouldn't be grieving, that their sibling wasn't that big a deal. And so many struggle with learning to have fun again. They need to be serious all the time. One thing that can happen for some children is they begin to realize the only way they can connect with their parents and get noticed by their parents is if they talk about their sibling who has died. So they have to enter into their parents' grieving process and grieve with them in order to get attachment. And so they have to basically trauma bond. That's the only way to get attachment, is through talking about deep pain, but you can't talk about anything else. And so a child goes, well, that's better than nothing. Let's do it. Let me give you one final thing that I think is quite interesting as to a characteristic. So Donald Winnicott is a British pediatrician and a psychoanalyst, and he's wrote this: one of the most meaningful maternal functions is what we call emotional holding. And so he relates the function that in parents of any sex to the significance of the physical aspect of holding a baby. Emotional holding is the steady emotional arms, available presence of the parents that allow the baby to feel safe and protected. So you hold the baby physically, but emotional holding is the child senses there's an emotional safety as well. They can be fully authentic. They can be fully human. And they're going to be loved and accepted and nurtured and comforted. All of that is going to happen. So the parent holds the baby in his or her mind, available to tolerate the baby's emotions, tuned into her signals. When a baby feels safe, both physically and emotionally, she develops a sense of a safe world where she can rely on the parent and trust that her needs will be met. But when emotional holding collapses, the baby usually stops turning to others and instead turns inward. When the baby feels dropped, so the parent's not holding me anymore, it's like they're feeling they're dropped, She might experience what Winnicott called falling forever. It is the feeling of emotional collapse and endless downfall with no bottom. I think that's a brilliant insight into what many feel who all of a sudden aren't feeling emotionally held by their parents anymore. They feel dropped emotionally, and now they feel like they're falling forever. Let me go to a third subtle form of complex trauma, and that is living with a sibling with a chronic illness. So we just talked about a sibling who died, but now we're living with a sibling who has a chronic illness. So what can come out of that is that now your sibling gets all your parents' time and attention, because they do require a lot of attention. They're not trying to get it. They're not being bad. They're not trying to demand it. They need it. Often the sibling needs special care. And so exceptions are made to them. There's certain fixed boundaries for everybody else in the family, but this child, there's different boundaries for this child. They get more time. They get more privileges. They don't have to do what the other kids have to do. They don't have to do the chores. And so there's exception after exception. And then the parents run at the drop of a hat every time something is wrong with that other child. And so the parents are more highly attuned to that child, more ready to run and meet their needs than they are to the other child. But then often the parents, because that child needs so much work and care, the parents are often exhausted. And it's not because they're doing anything wrong. They're just loving that needy, hurting child, but they're exhausted all the time. Often the parents are in a constant state of anxiety, especially if the child's health is very fragile. Are they going to lose the child? Are they going to have a turn for the worst? So there's a lot of undercurrents of anxiety going on all the time. Sometimes the parents are worrying and obsessed with that. And so they can't concentrate on other stuff. There's just worry there all the time. And that can lead to, they just don't have patience for the other children's problems. And so they get more patient and more irritable with the other children. And then they can set unrealistic standards for the other children. You should be giving up your needs. You should be helping out. You should be doing extra chores. And so the bar gets set higher and higher for the other children, because this child takes so much time, energy, and attention. Life for a child in that family with a sibling who's chronically ill is that it can often move from one crisis to another. And so there's another trip to the hospital. The ambulance just showed up at the house again. Everybody's rushing to the hospital because the child had to be admitted. And so there's an element of chaos. It's just life isn't as predictable and consistent as it would be in a home where everybody's healthy. Then the child is being trained to give up their needs, to give up their desires, to give up their rights, because the needs of the sibling are greater. And so the child is actually being trained to be codependent, to take an inferior role where you don't matter, where your needs get put down, where you just sacrifice, and that can set them up for huge problems later in life. But then it's also leading to huge shame again, because I don't matter as much as my sibling. I have to put my needs aside. So I guess I'm not that important. I guess I'm not worth that much. And the child develops this deep shame core belief. But then a child can feel like their home is a prison. So when they're at home, they can't play, they can't make noise, they can't have friends over because their brother or sister is too sick. And so home is not a fun, safe place. Home is a place where you're constantly on guard, where you have to be constantly suppressing all your natural human childlike stuff. Then that can lead to the child having heightened anxiety. Is my sibling going to die? And so now they've got their own anxiety. Their parents got their own anxiety. But then another type of the anxiety can be the child is wondering, am I going to get sick too? My sibling's sick. Am I going to catch it? That can be a big issue. And then the child could also have some guilt that is going to be happening, that somehow they caused their sibling's illness, or that could have done something to prevent it. So now there's guilt on top of the anxiety and the shame. Others have some survival guilt. Why is my sibling sick, and why wasn't I the one that got sick? I think I probably should have been the one that got sick because I'm not as good a kid as my sibling. So there's some survivor guilt. Other children then go to some really deep anger. Hey, I'm sacrificing all the time. I can't have any fun. My parents are getting annoyed with me all the time. I'm giving up my needs. I'm being neglected. It's work, work, work around here. And there's a deep anger that's beginning to develop because of all of the extra responsibilities, the higher bar, the neglect. Some become jealous of this ill sibling because they're getting all the attention, and they almost kind of wish they were sick. And so some can start creating little illnesses and sicknesses to try to get their parents' attention, because that seems to be the main thing that causes their parents to want to connect with a child. And then for some, if you have a sibling that's chronically ill, they're embarrassed to go in public with that child because they look different. They're in a wheelchair, they're on crutches, they're very weak, their hair's falling out, whatever. There's an embarrassment that they feel for being seen in public with this child. So you can see all of those things are doing those deep things inside the child that are complex trauma characteristics. Let me give you a final one. What happens if you had a chronic illness as a child? What I want you to understand is that when you have a chronic illness as a child, it's almost like it creates a complex trauma environment. You now feel like you're not in a safe world and that you can't resolve this problem of not being safe. And that's what complex trauma is. So living with a chronic illness is living within an unsafe world that you can't resolve. So it's a complex trauma world. And so what happens for many children with chronic illnesses themselves is they can't resolve it. They're trying, but nothing's making them better. And so what do they then do? I need to go to fight, flight, or freeze. I can't cope. So I will numb, avoid, I will have constant distractions, and they can slide into addictions because the constant pain and frustration that they can't resolve. Now, what can make this worse is when their parents resent their chronic illness because it adds an extra burden to the parent's life. And if that parent expresses exasperation at times for how much work they are, wow, that can just produce a ton of shame, self-hatred, guilt within the child. They just feel now like such a burden. They just feel now like they're unwanted. Like it just can do so much deep shame formation within a child. And then the child begins to hate themselves. They resent their limitations. Why can't I be like a normal child? Why can't I play like a normal child? I hate my life. Some children then escape into fantasy worlds. So I can't be happy in my current world because I'm sick all the time. So let's create this fantasy world where I'm strong and I'm a hero and I can do what everybody else does. And they develop this rich fantasy life as their way of escape. Others, though, fall into deep depression. They hate themselves, they hate their life, and that leads to just suicidal thoughts. I don't want to stay sick forever, I just want to die. But then there's some things that can make it even worse for a child. A lot of children with chronic illnesses have chronic illnesses that aren't physical things that can be fixed with medication. So they go to a doctor, the doctors run tests, and the doctor goes, I don't see what's wrong here. I can't put a name on the illness. maybe it's in their head. Wow, the damage that can do. The child knows something's wrong, but now people are suggesting that maybe it's in their head. That can do so much damage. Then they go to school and they get teased, they get made fun of. Kids develop names that they call them. That can do so much damage. That form of verbal abuse and bullying that can come out of having that chronic illness. And then at school, you're not able to participate in all the school activities. You're constantly a spectator. You're constantly feeling like a burden. You're constantly being treated differently than other kids. That just adds to the shame message that is already formed inside of you. And then what can even make it worse is to have older aunts or uncles in the family or friends of the parents who you overhear them say, I think they're just acting sick to get attention. Whoa, that can do so much damage. Or they say things that kind of imply, you're not going to be much good in life if you're not going to be able to work. Who's going to want you? All their value comes from performing and producing in work. So if you can't work, then you're no good. Wow, that's hurtful. Or nobody's going to want to marry you if you're sick, as if that's where all your value comes from, is being wanted to be somebody married to you. And so you can get such hurtful little comments made by older relatives and friends of parents that can just cut strips in your soul. And so as a result of that, many children with chronic illnesses can fall into that self-pity, just feeling sorry for themselves, just becoming a perpetual victim that they just can't do anything. And then that can lead to entitlement, that now I almost demand that others do stuff for me. I demand that the world gives me a life. The world takes care of me. They owe it to me. So that entitlement can develop. And then a deep anger about how unfair your life is, the limitations you have, an anger at yourself, an anger at the world, an anger at your higher power. And then some even begin to develop a resentment to anybody that shows them empathy. They just get mad at them. They don't want empathy anymore. They're just full of anger and depression. Or they get a resentment towards any family that has all healthy children. Like they just hate that family. And so that just something has poisoned their soul, where now they just have to see everything that's good through negative eyes. So those are just 4 very subtle forms of complex trauma. The sad thing to me is that they're very common, and I expect many of you have gone through them. And so, again, what I want you to understand is what we do, our work in the LIFT program, REACT programs, is to help people begin to deal with the complex trauma and heal, to see the depth of the shame and heal from the shame. And so I really hope that if you're seeing, wow, Tim just described me, I need to get some help, and that there is help available that will bring lots of growth and healing in these very damaged areas. Well, that's the end of another Friday night. Again, thank you for being with us.